Good morning. Good to see lots of good familiar faces out here today. Jonathan said he wasn't very good with math. Well, I'm not very good with words, so I'm going to switch up and use a lot more numbers. This is kind of a moment to make sure that we level set and basically understand some of the provisions that have been described around crop insurance in the new Farm Bill. I'll give you the punchline ahead of time in case you have other things you really had to do this morning. There's not a lot of change. This is not the most exciting topic in some sense to talk about. At the same time, though, the provisions that have been described, I think, have been interpreted kind of casually. RMA released just today some of the details on provisions for yield exclusion, for example, and we've heard a lot about that as though it's a way to knock out your low yields. It's not. We've heard a lot about supplemental coverage option as a way to up your coverage in some cases. Well, in a sense, it's actually not. So I want to go through and in a sense, kind of demystify some of the components of the Farm Bill that relate to crop insurance and some other kind of topics close to that. I'll be pointing every now and then with the pointer and won't be able to see exactly where I am, so you may have to guess along the way what I'm actually trying to say on some of the slides. But to start, I want to start by going back in time a little bit and make sure you have context. Because there are a lot of things that are different about crop insurance, a lot of things that are really different going forward. They just aren't really driven entirely by the Farm Bill. So I want to go back and build enough of a story that when we say one of the things that changes is this, you can see where it comes from. So first, simply look backwards at time and think about how unique 2014 was. So, and even prior to that, what's the best thing that happened in 2013? The drought of 2012, because we started with fairly high prices, right? So in 2014, we had really, really high yields, and the result of that was we had very low prices. But something that's sometimes overlooked is the countervailing effect, or the countercyclical effect, since prices and yields are negatively correlated. We actually got quite a big bump in what the sort of trigger points were, because the harvest price was only about 76% of the projected price for corn. As a result, if you think about coverage as a fraction of your yield you had to achieve, and below coverage as the fraction of yield below which you get a crop insurance payment, what you notice is that relationship was broken by the fact that we had really low prices and really high yields. In the case of 85% coverage, you could have had 113% of your expected yield and still triggered a payment. That's sort of the break point. So remember that. It's not just a straight out coverage is the amount that on a fraction of yield below which you have to hit in order to get a payment. It's really a revenue product. When we get to SCO and the conversation about that, that will actually be a fairly important concept. All the way down to 65% coverage roughly became 85% yield coverage, right? Because we had a really big drop in prices. Soybean, similar factors. The decline from projected price to harvest price period was not as great, just because it's a nice little point. At 85% coverage, because of the price decline was 85%, that's the one place you do get a match. You can grow 100% of your expected yield and be at the trigger point in revenue sense for getting a claim. So again, crop insurance behaved very much like it should have. The yields on the right are just taking an assumed APH on both sides, the corn and soybeans, to say where the trigger point on yield might have been for that. Okay? Here's kind of the price history, a reminder of how unique the last few years actually have been, and probably where we're headed. We've been around the state for 5 days now, and each day you kind of get yesterday's story, in a sense. We can only update prices about that fast. But I'm not quite sure where prices are going, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be lower than they were the last few years. Our projected price is calculated during the month of February, taking the average of the closing futures prices for December contract for corn, November contract for soybean during the month of February, and then that becomes the starting price, the projected price, what RMA uses to insure or create an indemnification on crop insurance contracts. That's not the same as the starting price during the period of sign-up. There's a great big optionality built into this. If the prices in February go from low to high and have an average of 430, well, you start with a higher actual price, and you expect harvest price to become more valuable, for example. So again, I don't know where it's headed, but I think we're going to start at a lower number, and using today's gauge of what the futures markets say, about 430 for corn, 10-something for soybeans. And that's really the biggest change, much bigger than the Farm Bill. On top of that, the implied volatility factors are quite a bit higher starting out this year than they were last year for a very simple reason. If you think corn could have about $1 movement during the season, Dollar movement, and these are not the prices, by the way, but because I can do the math in my head better, if you started out with, let's call it $8 corn, a dollar movement is what percentage volatility? 12.5, right? If you start at $4 corn, a dollar movement is 25% implied volatility. So the scale of the underlying price, in some sense, helps us figure out how to treat that higher volatility or lower volatility. In the calculation of premiums that you'll see later, the volatility factor has about as much of an impact. It has a lot more impact than most people realize, but it is also a really big change from the prior year when we're looking at starting off our insurance coverage going forward. Again, this is just kind of the level setting part of the presentation. We want to remember where we were so that when we look at where we're going to be, we don't make the mistake of just saying things like, well, it's a 30% decline. Well, it's a 30% decline from the maximum, but it's kind of at the long run average. We'll think of it in those terms. Okay. Another nice way to look at it is just the change in revenue coverage by election level if everything were at the kind of midpoint of production. So the example we have here is a 190 APH, kind of consistent with parts of Champaign County. You guys are about the first place, by the way, that actually answered the question, what were your average yields? It's like asking people, what were your cash rents? Zippers all around. Nobody wants to admit that they had good yields, but still complain about the lines at the elevator. So here's just a reduction kind of in magnitude that you would get from just the amount of change in the price alone under standard revenue products, $40 to $50 to $60, depending on where you are and where your APH is by coverage. But that's a really significant decline in the amount of revenue you can guarantee basic coverage on. Very big deal. And then the last way I want to look at it, kind of so we can take these cuts again later when we go through the programs. Corn at $4.30, if you produced exactly your APH, how low would prices have to get in order to begin to trigger insurance? This becomes also very important because, as was described earlier by Jonathan and Gary, the connection between SCO and our other crop insurance decisions really critically depends on what you believe about prices. And if you look at what prices have to do to get a coverage triggered at 80% to 85, you're kind of right around that PLC breakpoint on corn, right? You're about at the 370. If you get below 330, which is another really critical number, you kind of think about what the coverage elections are that might generate that, given where we're starting with prices today. So again, one of the punchlines will be that the complication of the whole story got a lot greater this year. It's just tougher to make all the decisions simultaneously because they're highly interrelated. I don't think Jonathan's still in the room, but next time he's in the room, remind me to make a joke about who could have written such a complex farm bill, because it was essentially Jonathan. So, anyhow, the soybean and corn numbers here, you can just see how far prices would have to decline. USDA, as many of you have seen on your phones perhaps this morning, has re-released their baseline numbers again today, dropped them a bit further again. But it helps us think about how far prices would have to go before the crop insurance sort of prevented the effect of them going any lower. Okay. What you have read about by now, I presume, are the three major changes in the Farm Bill that tie directly to crop insurance and the crop insurance title that are farmer side. There were lots of other provisions related to treatment of crop insurance and subsidy and support for the system and so on. But these three people have seen in the press and they're starting to wonder, how does it apply to me? The first is there's a provision for conservation compliance being required to be eligible for some of the benefits. Turns out this one is not that scary. The final rules haven't been written yet, but unless things that we don't expect happen, they won't be terribly onerous and in fact make a lot of sense and are things that good farmers are probably intent on doing anyhow. These are just simply not, as some of the early scares were, this is not a way for EPA to now start regulating crop insurance. It's a fairly sensible set of things that you, as I said earlier, probably likely were doing anyhow. The second one, this is a big deal because this one lasts. And even if you aren't eligible now, the chance that you might be because of a really bad outcome in the future is really important to appreciate now. Plus, your crop insurance sign-up forms actually will change going forward now. They have an extra set of boxes you have to answer things on. And they're continuous policy provisions, so once you make a decision, until you technically go back in and change that decision, they kind of last. They're not like the Farm Bill in the sense that they're permanent, once made, always made. But the yield exclusion is really important because it provides the following: the ability for you to drop a yield out of your APH calculation for coverage purposes only based on a set of conditions. The conditions were actually written at conference, not generated by the House or Senate, but so they weren't vetted quite the same way, and they'll have some funny implications, I think, if you think through how the wording of it actually goes. If you are in a county or contiguous county had a prior year yield less than 50% of its prior 10-year average, that county is eligible for you to drop a yield out of your APH. Okay, now let's go through some of those. That was a really long sentence, lots of commas. It's how policy gets written. But contiguous county, you can have corner-to-corner contiguity so that 3 counties away, corner-to-corner, in Texas, maybe 300 or 400 miles, right? It just requires that an area suffered a single year that was below 50% of its prior 10-year average yield. Bear with me for a while. The problem with that, of course, is if you're in a county that had a whole bunch of bad yields, your average is also lower, so the ability to get less than 50% of that is actually diminished as well. So the maps will look a little funny when you see where there's eligibility. I don't think that was quite intended, but again, written by lawyers, not necessarily good at math. That's how it was written. Secondly, you don't get to drop your low yield. You get to drop the yield in the year that the county experienced that, or one of the related counties. You may discover that you had above average yields in all of your database. You still get to choose if you want to drop the one that is in the year that the county or a related county had a low yield. This might really matter in certain parts of the area that were kind of on fringes of drought-stricken areas, because you can drop out a yield. Your APH can go quite a bit up. It does not, however, change your rate yield. A really good question we got yesterday, hopefully anticipating the questions we might get today. If you drop a yield, do you get to add another yield on the back end? You can keep up to 10 years of yield in your APH database. If you drop a yield, you do not get to add the 11th year back in. The reason is the same 10 yields that you had stay in your rate yield database. It's kind of a complicated calculation, but you don't get to get rid of your rate yield by excluding a yield. You're upping your coverage, but you're not changing your rates. You're not changing your rating structure. Okay. This is being primarily explained both in the RMA fact sheets, some of the things we did on FarmDoc, what we're doing going forward, as a change in your effective coverage. A way of thinking about it is, instead of picking 65, 70, 75, 80, 85% coverage of a number, you're kind of picking bushels and calculating what the implied coverage would have been. It's not a very complicated program if you think about it in those terms. If the yield you excluded drops you below the minimum count for trend, or affects the calculation of trend because of the interaction of your YE or YA yields, you can lose part of trend, though, by electing to exclude a yield. This could be really important for you, especially as you're picking up new ground and sort of accumulating the yield history if it were in a unit structure that you can't use the histories from, for example, or other reasons. You want to be a little careful about the impact of dropping one just to increase your yield in your APH if you also lose trend on all of your yields in your database. Okay, so I'll go through that one in more detail in just a minute, and then we'll go through the final yawn of the supplemental coverage option. It's just not very complicated when you look at it. So, okay, so this is the corn. Our best guess of the corn, the opportunity to drop 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 9 yields. It only goes back to 1995, implying that RMA is using from 85 through 94 as the first 10-year period to average. But if you have a 3-year rotation, some of those will be back before that could actually technically start. This is our best guess of where the counties that will be eligible for drops exist. As you can see in the Corn Belt, it's really 2012 explained these counties in the heart of the drought. But as you go to places that have more than one, it's really West Texas, Panhandle area, Oklahoma, areas that you might be able to drop up to 9. Now there's a slight difference between our calculation and RMA. RMA is not using NAS yields, they're using their own producer database. So a few more counties we expect than we have found will be eligible. Soybeans in Illinois, there are almost no counties. It's really hard to get a county average below its own 10-year history. Wheat, quite a bit more eligibility in Illinois, for example, but you can really pick out the areas that are going to benefit on the APH side from this. Okay, now how does it actually happen? What are the things you need to pay attention to? And remember, this applies going forward, maybe forever. So even if you're not in a county that shows it, you'll see it on the box on your sign up this year. If you don't have eligibility, you need to understand how the calculation works. It's becoming a common practice in RMA to use the same methodology for lots of things. Trend, in a sense, trend adjustment. I assume everybody, especially after 2012, understands trend. Choosing to accommodate differences in your database from what you expect to produce in the future is becoming an ongoing kind of theme at RMA, to the point that eventually land may be rated for crop insurance where you walk over and put a pin on the map, and that determines the location without your own yield history. In this case, it does not depend on your individual yields. You do not get to drop a low yield just because you have a low yield. So throw away myth number one. Myth number two, last year was a really bad outcome, I don't have to include it. Wrong again. The immediately preceding year is never available for exclusion because of the technical requirement of testing whether a year is less than its preceding 10 years, and the date of this election doesn't necessarily happen in time to calculate that. So last year's production reports don't all have to be in time to determine whether that county on RMA database is less than its preceding 10 years. They're also likely to move the production reporting date. This is my opinion, is there's some pressure to move it closer to the closing date of insurance, so those might converge anyhow. You can choose this on an individual APH database, and you can change the decision in the future. That's new information as of this morning, actually, that you can change it in the future. So if you choose to exclude it this year, but next year you find out that the plug is better, and a different one could have been excluded, or a different combination of years give you a better outcome, and it's complex, it's not just the level of APH, then you can go back and reverse that decision. If you don't say anything, though, it's like all other continuous contracts in crop insurance. Whatever you decided in the past rolls forward in this until you switch AIPs or make the election to change. It only allows actual yield options. So if you have substituted for an actual yield, or you have an actual yield, then you can drop those on things like written agreements. If one of the items used was not an actual yield, or in other plug cases where there wasn't an underlying actual yield, you can't throw those out, period. And it's, again, very similar to changing the amount of insurance. So the collection of 3 or 4 slides coming up here that I'll have to kind of scan forward and backwards in to tell the whole story at once. Won't all fit on one. But let's kind of go through this by looking at the steps that one would have to take in order to figure out what your coverage is and what you have to pay for it. So if you have identified that you have a year to drop that's eligible from your APH database, then if you do drop it, I'm going to skip down here, average of the remaining years becomes what's called a coverage APH. So take your original APH database, calculate the average, call that your rate yield, drop one out, recalculate the higher number. You would never drop one, by the way, if it reduced your average. If you drop that and it increases your APH, that's your new coverage APH. Now I'm going to have to switch forward and backward a little bit to explain how RMA calculates what you have to pay in crop insurance. This is a bit stylized and simplified, but the process is well depicted by this presentation. It's just not the 97 formulas that are used to come up with the numbers. RMA does something very, very simple in practice. Add up all the yields, or I'm sorry, add up all the claims in a county and figure out how many dollars of liability they paid out in claims. So take everybody's cars, figure out what they're all worth in total, take everybody's claims in this room, figure out what all the claims were, take the value of the claims divided by the value of all your cars. That's the average rate I would have to charge against the value of your car for your car insurance. RMA does that like you are all the same drivers in the county, only with crop insurance. So take all of the losses, divide them out by the amount of liability covered, and in this case I'm going to start by saying at sort of low coverage 60% you pay about less than 1%. When you get out here to 90% or so, you're paying about 4% of the liability. If you've insured $1,000, you have to pay $40 for it in the rate. So go back to that all this does is it changes the point on that curve that you're looking up your rate. But we have to do that under the format of insurance. So here's the simple steps for calculating it. Suppose you have a 180 APH because you simply had 10 real years of yield, and they were all good, and they were all true yields, and you averaged them together. If you elected 80% coverage, you would have 144 bushels of coverage. You can multiply all this through by price, by the way, to make it a revenue product. That's a very separable stage. That means if we looked it up on that curve in this county, these county level curves are all over the place, by the way. So if you think, gosh, I farm across counties from Champaign to Piatt, and my farm spans the county line, it ought to be about the same amount, or go from McLean on group products to a neighboring county. These are absolutely all over the board based on who crashed what years in their cars. So we're going to look at this number first, which is at 80% coverage, that's my rate. At 80% coverage in this county, and this one is actually fairly close to Champaign County, that means we have a 2.47% coverage rate, or 2.47% of the liability we have to pay as a premium. Multiply that out, you get 3.55 as a premium in bushels prior to subsidy. If we had a $4 price of corn, and this were enterprise units, for example, you would have gotten a $7.53 premium for the farmer, okay, at 80%. Again, this is stylized, but it's really close to Champaign County. If you throw out a yield or two or three, a great question, how many can you throw out? All of them. Anything that's eligible, in fact. It's a funny provision, but anything that you want, you can actually exclude if you're in a county, and there are parts of Texas where that has half of the years. We get up to 191, all we have to do is look at this curve and say 191 bushels at 80% coverage was 152.8 bushels. If we take 152 divided by 180, we get 85% roughly, 84.89. That's an important number, keep that in mind. You'll see it in two more slides, why that creates an actual decision to make. If we go to the curve and look up that percentage, 85% roughly, we find our new rate, which is just under 4, 3.97, and we take the 3.97 and we find out that the premium in bushels, 3.97 of 152, gives us 6 bushels or 1287 premium rate. Okay, that's all they're doing in principle. There's a lot of steps to that. Now when you do that though, there's some other things you have to be aware of what it changed in your premiums that are being offered and potentially bought. And again, this is going to roll forward for a lot of time, so lots of outcomes might eventually become decisions for you. Here's why this matters. Suppose you had 180 APH and this 191 yield excluded APH. At an 80% coverage, you're at 144. After yield exclusion, that's about a 153. The 153 happens to also be 85% coverage under the prior to yield exclusion. Again, these numbers are cooked a little bit to make the relationship obvious. But what it gave you was 5% more coverage, just like we had in the curve, higher cost at that coverage. But what's different is the subsidy schedule by election declines. This one is the enterprise. I have the full subsidy schedule in a minute. So can you tell time this time though, Todd? Or do I have really 5 real minutes? Okay. So what you're actually doing is backing up coverage to get the same bushels, which has a higher coverage subsidy. So a lot of people jump directly to the next conclusion that you should take the crop insurance product as the higher total coverage. That's also false. Because the subsidy of 53% of an expensive policy can still be more dollars than 68% of a cheaper policy. So even with yield exclusion, the generally correct next step is still keep your coverage as high as you can. Don't use it to back off coverage just to get a higher subsidy rate, because I'll give you 100% subsidy on something that's 0, or I can give you a lower percent subsidy on something that's worth more, and you're better off taking the higher dollar valued contribution to your insurance. Okay, I'll skip some of this except to say some of the results can be that you can actually generate really high bushel coverage by excluding certain yields. You get way above 100% of your original rate yield because you had a low rate yield from some bad experiences. Tossing a couple out can actually make the average times 85% more than 100% of your original coverage. That creates a couple of additional pricing problems. We'll go on to SCO to get a couple of other important things kind of in front of us here. As was indicated, SCO is technically a crop insurance program. Don't confuse it with the decision of the Title I programs you have to make. After you make that decision, you might be eligible for SCO. I know, Jonathan said don't go buy trucks based on our advice on this, but my advice is to think of them as very separable. Don't think about the crop insurance decision in order to choose which of your programs to take, especially just based on SCO. If PLC doesn't make sense ahead of time, you probably won't choose it just to get access to SCO. Okay, so the schematic everybody always provides is here's your total revenue. You have to have some deductible to get some insurance, and this starts at 86%. And then you have a farm level decision on the percentage of coverage. It's really critical. Your revenue on your farm does not impact the payment from SCO. It's only a way of establishing a number they use to calculate the payment under the other program. Whatever coverage election you used, straight out, the 65, 70, 70, whatever percentage you chose on your underlying policy, has to be a combo product, can't be a group. Whatever number you chose, they just insert that into the calculation on the SCO. Okay? So then again, you have really high revenues, doesn't matter. You have a really big shortfall, doesn't matter. That number gets transferred to the other program and is independent of your own farm experience. It can also be that you get paid more than the total because of that. You might get an extra big claim on your underlying policy and get an SCO claim. So it breaks the correlation fairly directly. SCO on wheat for this year was implemented ahead of time. I don't have the map for corn and soybeans because it's everywhere. The next map would be very boring. 2015, it's everywhere. Here's a quick example. If we were in McLean County with a 185 APH and 420 on the projected price, the guarantee for an 80% policy at the farm level would be 622, and for an SCO, 668. So in table form, what's interesting is SCO guarantee does not change. The dollars it says have to be available for you are a straight out calculation based on 86% of. This assumed the county average was the same as the APH. The RP guarantee, of course, depends on the coverage you select, so the difference, which is the maximum payment SCO could make, is in the final column here. Obviously really, really big. It kind of equilibrates everything. No matter what policy level you chose at the underlying, the total revenue guarantee, this is how it was sold, is roughly the same. What's it cost? Well, let's take a look. Here's again McLean County. We had to use 2014 rates with a 420 projected price and a 0.21 volatility factor. It's slightly higher than that right now, actually. And if prices climb a little, it'll deflate a little. But right now, that's roughly the starting values. Again, correcting for the fact that we're not in March. If we corrected today's volatility for what it would be in March for the remainder, it's 21 on enterprise units. Well, SCO looks like this. It adds about enough to make the total premium about the same, except for the fact that SCO is subsidized everywhere at 65% and the underlying policies weren't. If SCO had been subsidized like a group policy, then these numbers would almost be the same all the way down, but it's a 65%, so you get a little curve here when the underlying policies are no longer subsidized at more than 65%. You get what people have thought of as the sweet spot for SCO, where the group side is subsidized at a higher rate than the underlying individual side. Again, that's not a big enough difference in my perspective to make a decision around, but important to see. SCO pays a lot, pays in a lot of years. Just the way it works, it gets triggered a lot. But it doesn't necessarily get triggered in the years that you have a yield shortfall or a revenue shortfall. And it doesn't necessarily completely backfill your farm's revenue shortfall because your county and your farm aren't perfectly correlated. They're not the same thing. It's triggered based on the county outcomes, and your farm outcomes can be higher or lower than that in a percentage of deviation sense and get a different payment. Okay. Here's the subsidy schedule, and again, just recognizing that SCO is 65 all the way down, and the others go from a much higher number down to a smaller number, or from a somewhat higher number to a quite a bit lower number. Okay. So the punchline on this is, even though these policies exist, the biggest deal really, by far, is that the starting prices are going to be lower. The volatility will be a bit higher. You probably will have a chance to buy up coverage if you weren't already at the top and not spend as much. Of course, you're not getting as many dollars coverage. That does two things. It makes it more important to buy higher elected coverage levels, and it leaves a bigger gap relative to your expenses that are probably not insurable directly. The second thing is that the SCO will have sort of these fillers kind of ideas in many program cases that aren't very highly correlated with your own on-farm revenue. When we kind of model it out, we have a program that we release every year in March to look at real policies after the final numbers have been done. And we look at SCO pretty closely, and the correlation between its payments and farm level payments are just not that high. So it creates a buffer, but you'd have to farm for the next infinite number of years for that to actually work out under the same conditions that we have this year. Champaign County, really quickly, 172 APH. I'll go through this very quickly because we're getting close to the Q&A. These are about what the premiums would be if all the information we had today stayed exactly like today. So the $15 RP, kind of in range. We think that's about right. Those top election levels, these numbers actually will change by more than the bottom ones will as we get final prices and final volatility. But these look about in range. Group policy is a lot more expensive. Move over to the middle of the state, group gets really expensive, and the southern part can really get expensive. And then the insurance payments we could look at that we would expect given today's conditions give us a net cost of insurance. Now this one's important to interpret very carefully. Negatives are good. You want cost of insurance to be negative, that it pays you back more than you get, because remember that the total program is run as a mutual fund, mutual insurance, I'm sorry. Every dollar put in premiums goes back out to the participants. It's a one-for-one. You drop money in, you get money out. But the government drops in up to 65% of the original dollars, and then 100% is paid out to the insureds. So the negatives should occur. It is intended to have those payouts that are greater than your farmer paid premiums in. That's an intended design of the program. And a lot of folks will look right over here and say, yeah, the group policies must be the best. There's the 1.5 multiplier. There's not an SCO, by the way. So that's another difference I forgot to mention. But here's how I think about it. Even though those are more negative, the risk impact is summarized very well in this almost final picture here. I think what's really critical going into next year when you have tighter margins, lower revenue prospects, fairly constant costs, as Gary and others have sort of described, there's not a whole lot of chance to, prices are down 25%, so my seed cost is going to go down 25%. That doesn't work, right? Bin-rin soybeans, I guess, maybe. But this sort of tail over here is what you really want to avoid. You don't want to end up with, you don't want to end up with revenue that is below some minimum amount that you can survive through the next period on. So this is the way to think about it. These revenue products push your expected out to the right further. What you want on this graph, of course, is all the probability to be further to the right. The bottom axis is dollars of revenue per acre. The vertical axis is probability. I want the highest probability of having the most revenue. It simply pushes you off to the right. You want these curves to get shifted. Buying insurance on average for an automobile just stands the lines up. It takes away bad outcomes at the top, gives you back bad outcomes at the bottom, and you basically get a certain number, or the probability is all the numbers will be the same. In crop insurance, it's quite different. These bottom tails are cut off best by revenue products. The entire distribution is shifted to the rightmost in the group products. So if you have the wherewithal to farm forever, don't care what any particular year's outcome is, and there's no risk of that, a lot of folks will gravitate toward the group policies. They tend to generate more over the long run. There's a big multiplier in them. If you instead care about that year's outcome and matching the differences in your revenue you generated and filling in the shortfalls with insurance, then the revenue policies make a lot more sense. And so that's what we tend to promote from a risk management perspective. The revenue policies cut off the lower tail quite well. Blue line, no insurance. These two vertical lines down here are the RP and RPHPE. Tend to cut off that bad set of outcomes really, really well, even though the average payment over time is not as high as the group policies. So, okay, final thoughts, and then we'll get everybody up in front for questions. Gary mentioned, stole one of the punchlines. If you are in a county commodity that only has 75% coverage available to you, and it's wheat in particular, for example, and you want to effectively cover more of your crop, then PLC, if you've chosen that, allows you to then have SCO to a higher coverage level, but you hope your outcomes are correlated with the county. It makes most sense when your farm level crop-specific revenues are more correlated with the county in which the SCO is rated. There's not a whole lot of extra risk protection if all you're doing is covering between 85% election and 86% SCO. That's a pretty skinny little shallow loss kind of program, right? It doesn't really add a whole lot of coverage. If you happen to go from, if your typical purchase is 85% and you can get up to 86 though, there's a little bit extra in there, and it does make higher payments on average over time. And it's just not necessarily in the year that you need it the most. So be prepared to bank those differences. Another thing to remember, and really helps us argue against buying down your coverage. Again, this is the biggest deal as you go, toward the Dakotas perhaps, but we don't want you to buy down coverage to get the higher subsidy under SCO, because your underlying coverage policy, the underlying policy's coverage also influences your preventive plan payments. And again, most folks on this particular final decision will find ARC itself to already be more attractive. And as indicated earlier, you just can't mix ARC with SCO anyhow.